if I have to be totally honest with you, I didn't really like the playing. Articulation! Ooh, I forgot that I selected this video. This is something really, really, really beautiful. I mean, isn't that just some incredible flute playing? I think it's so different from 100 years ago. No video on the last 100 years of flute playing would be complete without this giant of a flute player. Guys, this is Tats from the future, and I'm going to warn you, this video is really long, but how do you summarize 100 years of flute playing in anything less? But here's what I'm going to promise you. It's worth it, so keep watching. The flute is actually one of the oldest instruments in the world, but it feels like a lot has changed in flute playing traditions over the years. I've actually spent a lot of time thinking about how much flute playing has changed, especially in the last 50 years. So I thought, let's all climb onto a bit of a time machine here and look at flute playing over the last 100 years. Now I chose 100 years because this is more or less the earliest recordings that I could find, and I wanted to do some really cool listening today to really hear how things have shifted and changed over the years. But of course, I think our real starting point should be with Taffanel, Paul Taffanel, who was kind of like the great-great-great-grandfather of flute playing. And I think we can get a couple of descriptions about Taffanel's playing, which is really useful. Particularly the description of Georges Barerre, who is actually our first flutist that we are going to be listening to today, who described Taffanel as discouraging excessive expression, vibrato, and sentimentality. And this kind of brings us to this idea of the French school of flute playing, which is where we're beginning our journey today, which is a school of flute playing characterized by a quite quick, fast, sort of shimmering vibrato, a slightly softer but very colorful sound, very clear and crisp tone, and well, actually, let's just listen to how the French sounds. I'm going to add a little disclaimer to this video and say that some of these early recordings are really bad, so there are certain things in these recordings that I think we might actually not really be able to hear, but we'll do our best and kind of try and listen through these very early recordings. So let's start with our first listen, which is a recording by Georges Barerre. The recording is dated to 1915 by some random person on the internet, so that must obviously be true. No, I think it's more or less correct. Now, the interesting thing about Georges Barerre, he was a student of Paul Taffanel, so would have known him and his style of playing very well. He was born in 1876, which sort of feels like, how is there a recording of somebody born that long ago? But there is. An interesting fact about Georges Barerre is that he actually premiered Debussy's L'après-midi d'enfant, which is the prelude to an afternoon of a faun. I never get that name right, but that I think is correct. But the very, very, very famous flute solo. We are listening to Bach's Sonata in C major from 1915. So as you can hear, we've got some pretty consistent crackling going on there. I did warn you guys. But I think we get a really good idea of his tone here. We get this kind of very, quite fast, shimmering vibrato come through. It's fairly straightforward playing. There isn't this huge amount of over-expressive, over-dramatic stuff going on. Lovely, lovely tone, very nice quality of tone. Certainly not like this big, huge virtuoso tone that perhaps we might be used to. But that being said, of course, he is playing Bach. I think there's a certain measure of kind of restraint that you need for Bach anyway, even if it is 1915. Let's continue. So what is really interesting to me here is the articulation is almost a little bit like what I would probably reprimand my students for. I'd be like, let's clean up your articulation. It's a little bit wild. I'm gonna put it that way. Now there's a couple of reasons for this, and I think we're going to see this consistently in these early recordings, where on the one hand, I think that the precision of the instruments that we have today has improved a lot. I think the instruments are constantly developing and they're becoming much more precise and actually easier to play. So I think that's part of it. The other big thing is that we've kind of over-engineered so many of our recordings today, right? Like there's no room for kind of like mistakes, imperfections, or anything that's a little bit more rough and raw like this. So it's really interesting, really, really interesting. But still clearly, you know, the guy could play the flute. I mean, you don't become professor at the Paris Conservatoire just because. So our next wonderful flute player is of course none other than Philippe Gaubert. Absolute iconic player, worked quite closely together with Paul Tufnell, who was his teacher, but they also created that absolute iconic method book that we all know, the Tufnell and Gaubert method books. There's actually multiple books. He also composed some really beautiful flute music that I personally think is just incredibly beautiful, but certainly one of the absolute iconic figures of the flute world, and let's give his playing a listen. We've moved a little bit later, we're now in 1919. I mean, just listen to how light and effortless that articulation is, right? I mean, that's just so incredible. And I will say, in contrast to the Bach we just listened to, this is, it feels like a lot lighter articulation, not quite so kind of heavy and labored. I mean, you know, we can expect that every player is going to have their special gifts and their abilities, but just, if I think of French tonguing, this is what I think about. This very moment here. Just incredible. This is an absolute gem of a recording. It's Gaubert playing Gaubert. So this is a really good example where I don't think we're getting the full quality of his tone and his vibrato and his playing. Very unfortunately, because I can imagine it must have been just stunning to hear him actually playing live. But I think we can still get a little bit of an idea of the type of kind of sound he was creating. Again, that very kind of like shimmering vibrato, not this like huge wide vibrato. Beautiful phrasing and shaping, but also it feels like a little restrained. You know, it's not this like overly expressive, overly like over the top kind of playing. I think I would have loved to have sat in a real live concert and just listened to these guys. I think it must have been a completely different experience. Well, that answers my questions of what I would do if I could travel back in time. Go and listen to all these flute players play live. Of all the fun things I could do, that's what I choose, yes. I mean, just technically so solid. But I mean, like there was actually a little like squeak in there. And, you know, it's just so encouraging hearing these incredibly great players do what everyone else does, which is make small, simple mistakes from time to time. And it's okay. What have we done to our like mental health editing out all this nonsense? Really? We move on to our next amazing flute player who was a student of both Gaubert and Tufnell. You may have guessed it, we are talking about Marcel Moyse. He was actually a French-born flutist, but moved to the US and spent quite a bit of time in Canada, and in many ways helped establish the American school of flute playing. He has produced some incredibly famous players, people like James Galway, Paula Robertsons, Trevor Wye, William Bennett, Carol Winsense are just some of the students that have studied with him over the years. I mean, if I could travel back in time and get a lesson from Marcel Moyse, I mean, I think on the one hand, I'd be like mildly terrified. And on the other hand, like, it must be so amazing. I mean, that technical prowess is just, I mean, it just sounds like it's effortless for him. It's incredible. Something that immediately strikes me is it feels like, well, certainly we can hear that vibrato more clearly. We hear that very, very, very kind of narrow, small vibrato in the sound. I mean, what's interesting here is the vibrato is consistent throughout. Like we get very, very consistent vibrato. It almost to me sounds like the sound is a little bit almost throaty, if that makes sense. Where it feels like the vibrato is kind of coming from the throat, and sometimes even sort of hear a little bit of interruptions from the vibrato in the sound. It's just interesting because I think, we have a certain like aesthetic today of how we like flutes to sound. And it's just, I think it's so different from 100 years ago, like certainly. And it's just a good reminder that just because we think something is beautiful today and we listen maybe back and we're like, oh, well, that's, Marcel Moyes, I'm going to give you a lesson in how to loosen up your throat. I think that the aesthetic has just changed and shifted. And we should be very careful to label things. And I'm speaking to myself here because, well, I'm going to share some of my thoughts on this a little bit later. My own journey with this, but just very, very interesting. Articulation! Oh, it's insane! That guy's a machine. It's insane! It's insane! Wow, that's just amazing. 1927, Marcel Moyes, there we have it, folks. Let's on and up with our journey. We're crossing the Great Atlantic here. We're going over to the US. I mentioned that Marcel Moyes was a huge kind of founder of the US school of flute playing, but there was another really big key player here, and that is, of course, William Kincaid. He is known to be the grandfather of American flute playing in many ways. Absolute legend of a player, and surprise, surprise, he studied with Georges Barerre. No surprises there. Well, perhaps some surprises there. But again, we just get this incredible lineage of flute players coming through from France and then sort of spreading around the world. Let's listen. What's so interesting here is, and it's very, very hard to kind of like quantify this because again, we've got variation in recording quality and variation in pieces being played and all of that. But it feels like there's suddenly like a little bit more power and a little bit more oomph to the sound. Still getting that fairly narrow vibrato, still very consistent vibrato. Like, it's not that it's more virtuoso playing. I mean, like if I think of Moyes' articulation and also Corbet, or just, I mean, certainly incredibly virtuoso players. I think maybe just like a bit of a beefier sound is actually it. Really beautiful, like beautiful, beautiful playing. Lots of color. Very, very nice. Guys, we've dropped all these recordings down below in the description. You can go and listen through this whole journey on your own. I'm not going to obviously listen to all of them, otherwise we're going to be here all night. Cool. Thank you, Kincaid, for your beautiful playing. We move on. We're moving a little bit forward in time here to 1915, which is when our next incredible flute player was born, which is none other than Julius Baker. I think of all the players I looked at in this list, I think he has got the most number of famous students, in his repertoire, if I can say it that way. He has taught people like Mimi Stillman, Jasmine Choi, Gary Schocker, Jeannie Baxtresser, Jeffrey Kaner, and the list quite genuinely goes on and on. Like, just go and Google Julius Baker students. It's incredible. So I can imagine he must have been an absolutely incredible, incredible teacher. He studied with William Kincaid. So again, we're getting this nice lineage come through here. And he was the principal flutist of the New York Philharmonic for many, many years. Let's give Julius Baker a listen. Again, that slightly more beefy sound in comparison to the early French players. Still very kind of consistent, faster vibrato. But to my ears, and again, I'm going to listen to a different recording of him in a moment, of him playing something else, but it feels like there's a little bit more variation of the vibrato. Lovely kind of colorful sound is what I can say. It's like there's not as much variation as I think we hear in some modern players in terms of the sound and the phrasing, but like the actual sound, it just feels like it's got lots of colors in it, if that makes sense. Beautiful, beautiful playing. Let's go to a little bit of that fast movement. Not too fast. I like that. I like that. I mean, isn't it just incredible flute playing? You know what I love? It's like not too fast. It's not like this crazy thing. And it's like light and effortless. It's like he's not even trying. It's just so beautiful. I mean, he's trying, but if that makes sense, it just feels effortless. Just incredible. I think these guys understood something about flute playing, which was like, the goal is not to sound super impressive. The goal is actually to sound like it's not even difficult at all. You know, that is what I love. Like, it doesn't sound like a difficult piece. It just sounds effortless and easy. Our next player, I've actually spent a fair amount of time listening to his playing and his recordings, so it's no new one to me, but of course we are looking at Jean-Pierre Rampal. No video on the last 100 years of flute playing would be complete without this giant of a flute player. He was in some ways kind of one of the first real like superstar flute players of the world. I think certainly paved the way for some of our other big flute names that came out. He studied with Gaston Cronel, who actually had some really famous students or people that had worked with him, like James Galway, Michel de Bost, Maxence Larieux. What awesome virtuosic playing. Again, we're getting that consistent vibrato. It feels like the vibrato is a little bit broader already. It might just be my ears because I know where all of this is going. But certainly there's beautiful nuance in the vibrato and sound, which we might have had with those early French players, the recording quality just masking most of it. It's just the most incredibly virtuosic and flashy playing. I mean, but we know this about Rampal, right? He is a beast of a flute player. We know this. So this next little video was actually quite a lot of fun. There's like a whole league of really great flute players in this next part of history, if I can put it that way. We've got players like Nicolet, de Bost, Alain Marion, Bennett. I mean, the list goes on, and I obviously cannot listen to all of these players, but there was a really nice little recording of some of them playing together. Specifically, we've got Nicolet, de Bost, Bennett, Adoyan and Wilson playing together. Most of these guys studied with either Moyes or Cronel or a bunch of other famous teachers of the time, but certainly part of this same lineage of flute players. All fantastic, amazing flute players in their own right. But let's give this nice little chamber music piece a listen. I thought it was quite fun. Nicolet! I'm sorry to stop this incredibly beautiful music. I'm annoying myself. But I think what's really interesting here, listening to this now, Nicolet was born a little bit later than Rampal, 1926, I believe. And I feel like what we're getting here is, again, like, we're just getting a little bit more variation in that vibrato. Like right at the end of that phrase, he had almost no vibrato, kind of tapering it off. Which is, again, just interesting, going from that sort of almost consistent vibrato. And I think we're going to see this pattern continue into modern age. We're going to see, and we're going to have some fun with it. But listen to that gorgeous sound. I think Nicolet has just got one of the most incredible flute tones. Really, like, I just love his playing. Listen to that. I could listen to that all day. We got to move on to the next one. By the way, at this point, if you can tell me who one of Nicolet's very famous students was, drop a comment below. It shall be revealed a little later. Michel de Bost. You can see William Bennett there in the back. Listen to that gorgeous phrasing. I think the thing that really stands out to me with his playing is just such like beautiful expressive phrasing. Lovely, lovely. I wish we had more time. I'd listen to all of these flute players and make you guys all listen with me, but we don't. I was trying to figure out who's who here between, I have to say, I don't know Ranson Wilson. I don't know him or his playing at all. To me, this looks like Adayan, but I don't know. But whoever this is, whoever you are, gentlemen, there, your playing is stunning. I love it. It's like just so beautiful. Listen to that sound. It's like so dark and buttery. Like if I look at more modern photos of Adayan, that embouchure almost looks like his, but I don't know. Who is that, internet? Who is that? But we go on to none other than Le James Galway himself, of course. Again, no video would be complete without James Galway in the mix. He needs very little introduction, the man with the golden flute, and of course, very famously studied with Geoffrey Gilbert. Galway, I think in many ways represents the more kind of British school of flute playing, as does William Bennett, who we just saw as well. But of course, he would have had a lot of influences from many of our French guys too. Ooh, I forgot that I selected this video. This is something really, really, really beautiful. So Galway was principal flute of the Berlin Philharmonic for many, many years. And this is a live recording from him playing the Daphnis et Chloe in 1974. This is probably one of my favorite flute solos of all time. Galway, I'm excited. Isn't that just beautiful? Beautiful playing. Interesting here is we've again got that fairly consistent vibrato. It's definitely feels like a bit of a broader vibrato though, and a like a bigger, fuller, more open sound. Again, comparing to where we started off, that just incredible Galway sound, right? I mean, you're not going to get around it. And what is interesting to me in this recording is it's a little bit less vibrato than he would use in his solo stuff for good reasons, right? You're playing an orchestra. You want to blend a little bit more with the orchestra and the sound. And also depending, like, you know, the Central European orchestras apparently did favor like a little bit less vibrato in their wind players or certainly in their flute players. So I think that would have come into it as well. But beautiful, just beautiful playing. Thank you, James Galway. The next group of players, although not entirely intentional, are kind of, I wouldn't say our first big female players on the scene, but in some ways, I guess they are our first big female players on the scene. Being a professional musician was something that was reserved for men for many, many, many years. In fact, and this is a true fact, the Vienna Philharmonic only allowed women into the orchestra in the 1990s. True story. Oh, the dark history of the orchestra. No, let's not go into that. But the point is that women would have been playing the flute on a more kind of like amateur basis, but to get into professional settings, playing orchestras and stuff, I can imagine must have been quite a fight. So we have got deep respect for these players who were born all in the 1940s and have done incredible things in terms of flute playing, but also in representing women in the orchestra. Paula Robinson, born in the US in 1941, studied with Julius Baker, became an incredibly well-known soloist, playing in Carnegie Hall multiple times, and all over the place for that matter. Let's give Paula Robinson a listen. That's lovely. I love the little way that she phrases off the ends of those phrases, and there's just this like quite humorous sense about this piece, which is just perfect. It's interesting again, you know, it's like, it's beautiful, virtuosic, gorgeous playing, but it's not that like 100% polished playing that we're used to seeing in all our recordings these days, right? There's like a sense of just realness about it. Like she's playing and there's the odd little things that are happening in there, which just adds to it and makes it beautiful and human and just gorgeous playing. Our next player, Carol Winsence, a real fixture of the classical music flute world. She's an incredible teacher, teaching at Juilliard for many years, an incredible soloist, has played in orchestras and solo with orchestras multiple times. Let's give her a listen. What a strong, beefy, gorgeous, dark, lovely sound. Awesome. And then that lovely change in color of the sound. Also getting still quite a nice strong vibrato coming through, but just what beautiful playing. Now I've done a video where I also spent quite a lot of time listening to Jeannie Backstresser. So of course, any discussion of flute playing of the last 100 years without Jeannie Backstresser would also not be a discussion, I don't think. But I thought this little recording was just so delightful and I thought I would share it. It is actually a recording of her and Julius Baker playing together. Of course, as I mentioned, Jeannie Backstresser was a student of Julius Baker. I mean, isn't that just gorgeous and lovely and wonderful and just so cool? Number one, I love it. It sort of steps out of the normal kind of classical flute mold. And number two, it's just such beautiful playing. We get that lovely, very sonorous, rich sound, full-bodied vibrato, gorgeous, gorgeous sound that I think if I had to kind of summarize this area of flute playing, this whole group, it's this kind of slightly broader, fuller, more rich vibrato. Very cool. And I mean, I'm sure there was variation in all of this. There were players that were doing different stuff. But again, just bear with me here as we move on to the next phase, because I think it's just really interesting to see how things start to shift. Now, I decided to throw in something slightly personal here. I was looking for a player who was born in that kind of 1950s period. And I landed on, well, I think in the meantime, a very obvious choice, which is my former flute teacher, Hans-Georg Schmeiser. He was born in 1956. He was the principal flutist of the Vienna Volksoper, or the opera, Vienna Volks Opera Orchestra, for over 30 years. He was also one of the professors in Vienna at the School of Music and Performing Arts. I never know how to say that in English. He studied with Alain Marion, who we haven't gone over today, but a really well-known player and teacher, and Wolfgang Schulz, who was the principal flutist of the Vienna Philharmonic for many years. And I had the amazing privilege of working with this incredible teacher. He very sadly passed away in 2019, and so I think he gets to be honored in this video as having his place in the flute history. I mean, obviously, other than the fact that I just absolutely love and adore his playing, it's very personal, very special to me. It's interesting to hear this in the context of where we've come from. So this recording was done in 2008. So it is a little bit of a jump for some of those recordings that we heard that was in the 70s or early 90s. But you can hear there's a very clear shift in the amount of vibrato being used and the variation of its use. Whereas I think in some of those earlier players, there was a lot more vibrato and quite consistent vibrato. We're kind of moving over now into less vibrato and less consistent vibrato, and it being used kind of in key emotional moments rather than being kind of used all the time. And we're going to carry on this journey because we're going to see this trend continuing in just a moment in our next amazing player. Remember I said I was going to have one of Nicolet's students on here today? Well, I do, of course. It is none other than Emmanuel Pahu himself, principal flute of the Berlin Philharmonic to this day, an incredible soloist. He was born in 1970, and let's just listen to how things have shifted here. I'm going to press play again in a moment. Just listen to how many of his notes there's almost no vibrato. It's this very clear, very pure, very expressive sound, but very little vibrato, actually, in comparison to where we've come. Just listen again. Now, it's fair to say, okay, that's cool, but this is like more Central European style. Maybe they just play with less vibrato. Maybe it's not everybody. And there's something to be said about that. As I mentioned, I think the Central European orchestras, for example, do prefer a little bit less heavy vibrato. But I think we've seen this style changing consistently throughout. Let's go to a US player, a really, really, really great US player, Damar McGill, also studied with, yes, you guessed it, Julius Baker and Jeffrey Kaner for that matter. Absolutely fantastic player, born in 1975. He's actually married to a South African woman. He's been to South Africa, to Cape Town many times. So welcome from South Africa, Damar McGill. But listen to this playing and just contrast this a little bit. Isn't that just some incredible flute playing? It is so beautiful. It is just so beautiful. I have listened to this recording a few times and I can't get over it because it is just so beautiful. But again, you can hear how much less vibrato there is in the playing suddenly. We get a lot more kind of work with the air, with the dynamics, with the shaping of the notes, and less of the vibrato. I'm not saying it's bad or good, although I have my opinions about it, but what I'm saying is it's different. Things have shifted and changed. And I think it's important for us to realize that when we're listening to earlier recordings, because one of two things can happen. Like either we're like, oh, well, it's just these early players was bad flute playing. Like how could they use so much vibrato? Or we can say like, oh, the modern players just come nothing close to the old days players, you know? And when we don't realize there's actually been a shift in how we perceive what is beautiful and what we consider to be pretty, I think we can go wrong here. So let's go to the last player on our list. We are now in 2015 is where I got this recording from. We're now listening to a wonderful young player called Sebastian Jacot. I think one of like my personal great finds of the last couple of years. What an incredible player. Born in 1987, so he's just a few years older than me. I'm not going to say how many. He studied with Jacques Zune, another really great player that we did not have time to look at today. Let's give Sebastian Jacot a listen to. Very much the same stuff I've been speaking about, the change in the sound, the vibrato, all of that. I think what's interesting is the instrument he's playing on. So we're also seeing this kind of change in the type of flute. For many years, we've kind of had like a very standardized version of the flute or what the flute was. And what we've really seen, I'd say in the last like 30 years, this is explosion of different instruments. We've got like grenadine instruments or different wooden instruments, and combination of like wooden body and metal head joint, or wooden head joint and metal body. Just a whole bunch of interesting and cool stuff that has kind of come out, which I think gives us a lot more possibilities, a lot more kind of scope of sound and different things which are possible today. Nice one to compare to that Rampal recording of the Reinecke. And in fact, I think that could be a fun thing to do, to take one piece and go through all of these guys with one single piece of music. I do want to just take a moment here to just kind of summarize and chat about my observations here. Now, I think that every single one of these players has had an incredibly important space and place in the last 100 years of flute playing. I don't think that there are any bad players here on this list, and for that matter, I don't think any of the big kind of superstar players of the last 100 years are bad players. But there are going to be things that you enjoy more and less, or some things that you're going to enjoy about a player, but maybe other things that you're not going to enjoy as much. Now, here's something that I'm going to share about my personal journey with this. When I was younger, I remember listening to a lot of flute players, very well-known flute players, and if I have to be totally honest with you, I didn't really like the playing. And as a result, I didn't really want to listen to that much flute music. Like, I loved the music, I loved playing the flute, but when I had to listen to other players, I didn't love it. And that's not because they're bad players. Again, with more maturity, I can actually listen to many of these players and be like, oh, this is so beautiful, and just appreciate what's amazing and good about them. But if I have to be totally honest with you, I have really loved the shift, specifically in the vibrato and in the tone, away from this kind of consistent vibrato and moving more into this kind of nuanced vibrato and sound. And this is going to be different. Some people are going to be like, no, I miss those beautiful kind of full vibrato sounds. Some of you are going to want even less vibrato in the playing. I think what's important here is to notice the shift and see the shift and realize what it is that you enjoy. I will say, these days with some of the younger, more modern players, I can get completely and absolutely carried away in some of their playing, in recordings, and I can spend hours just listening to it, which maybe I've just matured. Maybe I've just stopped being like a lazy, sloppy teenager. Actually have the time and the patience to listen to music in general. But I think I've really enjoyed the change in the aesthetic and the shift that's happened. As I said, let's see what happens in the next 20 to 50 years. Maybe we'll be doing crazy things. I don't know. What do you think? Comment down below, guys. What do you think? Who is your favorite player? Who was your favorite player on this list? And what do you think of the change over the last 100 years? Was it good? Was it bad? Or was it just what it was? Happy practicing, everybody, and see you guys soon.